So rather than give you a formal presentation, what I was asked to do is sort of raise some issues for consideration as we think about the future. And I think it's come up in a number of our sessions, is this relationship between the changing commercial nuclear energy landscape and our concerns about the future of nuclear security and non-proliferation. And embedded in that are some debates about, one, what is changing in the commercial nuclear energy landscape, and in particular for the United States, there's a very hot set of policy issues turning on the whole issue of the fear that the United States is really falling off a cliff. And I think that sentiment is also beginning to become echoed here in Korea with the new government's less than stellar commitment to nuclear energy on this end. And so there's some real concerns among some of the stalwart suppliers that the landscape is changing and they're going to be playing a much more modest role, and with that the nuclear security and non-proliferation regimes are going to be tested. And so what I want to do is talk a little bit about that changing landscape, which I think we've talked a lot about, so I can breeze through that, and then focus specifically on these two issues. How do we measure or think about the changing commercial landscape and the role of particular states, like in this case the United States, and is there a link between that changing commercial stature and the security concerns moving forward? Well, as you've heard throughout the seminar, and really I'm sure throughout your workshop, that there is a changing landscape, and with several colleagues who wrote a book a while ago that tried to assess that, and we came up with the conclusion that there was, notwithstanding the praise of halcyon days of a nuclear energy renaissance, we were mostly looking at a resurgence of nuclear energy in the countries that already were heavily invested in. There's mainly the CRICs at the time, which was Korea, Russia, India, and China, and now you can argue there's a question mark about the future in Korea. There was also the sense that, notwithstanding the shifting balance in terms of nuclear possessor and then exporters, that the market was going to be rather large moving forward, depending on how integrated the nuclear facilities are into the existing power grid systems. They can range from between 2.6 to, some people say, over $4 trillion business over the next 20 years. And as we just heard in the last panel, a number of regions stand out as real potential market areas, the Middle East and Southeast Asia, as well as those established nuclear power states. But the other thing that gets lost in a lot of these conversations is really how mature the global supply chain is. And that it's not just the vendors of the last repute, so to speak, the ones that sell the reactors, but there's a whole set of suppliers associated across the fuel cycle. That said, in the United States, we can't deny that there are indicators of our decline, given by, even our export presence and looking at our market power, looking at the number of new builds we have, the percentage of baseload power generation is relatively flat, but it's going to be challenged by the growth of power demand and challenged by natural gas and others. You see that the market share across the nuclear fuel cycle has shifted dramatically over really a 16-year period. The United States has really witnessed a decline in that market share across many of those segments. And this has raised, as I mentioned, real concern, really across the spectrum in the United States, within the industry, among arms controllers and non-proliferation community, within the government. If you've been reading what's coming out of the White House, the Trump administration is thinking about mandating nuclear power purchases by states and utilities out of concerns for national security. So there's a real animated hysteria almost in the United States about this declining share. But we have to keep a couple things in mind. What are we talking about in terms of stature? And how do we measure that stature relative to whom? And then, is there a link between these trends on the commercial side and the nuclear security and non-proliferation. And this is a project that we're just starting, so I can't show you our conclusions, but I can show you a couple things that may want to jar things in your mind. We've heard about 1, 2, 3 agreements, and those are really the standard of a tightening of our reflection of at least of the U.S. influence over its customers based on how restrictive those agreements are. And so what we did is we looked at all of those agreements and we coded them for quality. In other words, how restrictive were they? And we looked at about 5 different metrics and we gave them different codes. And one thing and then we pit those against a very common metric of the U.S. decline, which is the number of reactors we're building. Okay, and you can pick market power and you can pick other ones. They all tell you basically the same thing, which is this. The blue line is the number of reactor builds minus the decommissioned in the United States, which are going down. But then you look at the orange line, which is the quality, in other words, the restrictiveness of the 1, 2, 3 agreements are going up. So that conventional discussion about reactors and non-proliferation seems spurious at best. Now, you can argue, well, this is more complicated because some countries have actually, just while they've signed some of these agreements, they actually had other pursuits on the weapons side. So if you factor those in, you still see a trajectory of a tightening and strengthening of the restrictions in the 1, 2, 3 agreements, notwithstanding the trajectory of our companies. And the ROK is actually now facing it. You can see we're about at the same level in terms of the number of reactor builds. But this is when we do a little bit of the network analysis. This is the results of looking at 450 of the largest companies that work across the nuclear fuel cycle, and we're looking at the relationships that they have in their corporate partnerships, because we're trying to understand which companies are influential, or the most influential to other companies operating in this global nuclear energy space. And so we're measuring this not by dollars and cents or energy flows, but by social capital. How much trust these different companies have as measured by the quality of their foreign direct investment. Okay, and so the argument is that the ones in the center are more prominent in those networks, more influential. We're using, again, a betweenness score, so it's how important they are to the transactions within that space. And you see one thing that stands out here is that Siemens, until very recently, was the single most trusted party across the global nuclear fuel cycle, with Toshiba and Riva also there. I also have this interactive, but it would take too long to show you that. But the bottom line is the United States companies are all in the core, are all seen as trusted parties to other businesses that are operating across that fuel cycle. So irrespective of the number of reactors we're building, or if we're the vendor of last repute, as I mentioned, we're still quite influential to other companies operating in that space. And this is when you can disaggregate it. This is the red is the macro set of players across the fuel cycle, and the blue are those that are the most prominent in that particular segment. And you can see that particular segment, 3 players are there, but they're certainly disconnected from each other. And those that exist are the Chinese companies that are tied to Westinghouse. And there's also a link to Areva. Dell, a very important player, is relatively isolated in the core. Same thing, SMRs are seen to be a segment for the United States, and you see that American companies are quite prominent there, but they're primarily linked to other entities like Toshiba and Siemens. They're not just isolated. And you can look at the same thing in the Middle East, those companies that are operating in the Middle East. But this is when you just look at these companies by themselves in each segment, and one thing we see is that they're very disconnected, right? So to the extent that there are corporate ties, it has to do with not just looking at who's active in the Middle East, it's who's active, who's linked to other of the main influential players globally across the fuel cycle. And this is looking at, you see how Toshiba and Siemens are probably the strongest linked in an otherwise very dispersed Middle East set of relationships. So the more specific you get, the more isolated these companies become. But it does, when you look at the macro level picture, you do see that the companies that are operating in these different segments are tied to American companies that are in the core that are seen as very trusted parties throughout the commercial landscape, which is a very different picture than if you just look at the number of reactors, market power, et cetera, which are part of the debate. So the challenge is to see, does this relate, correlate with, like I mentioned, the growing quality of the 1, 2, 3 agreements or membership in different agreements. So that's what we're doing in the project. But it gives us some food for thought, and one, questioning how do we measure corporate stature, and then how do we draw the links between that corporate stature and trends in that corporate stature and non-proliferation and nuclear security. And I'll be happy to talk more about this later.
Thank you very much for your